The story of Helen Keller has often focused more on her disabilities rather than her fight for disability rights and racial justice, as well as her stance against fascism. In his new book, After the Miracle, The Political Crusades of Helen Keller, journalist and New York Times best-selling author Max Wallace brings to light Keller's lifelong efforts to improve humanity. Max, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So a lot of us are familiar with the story of Helen Keller, that Keller was a young child in the late 1800s. She was born deaf and blind, but with the help of her teacher, Annie Sullivan, Keller had a breakthrough in learning to spell out letters on the back of her hand. And back then, it was hailed as a miracle. Annie's biographer wrote, "Religions have been founded on less." Has it been lost, though, how significant of an achievement this was?
Well, it was certainly an achievement because she was the very first that had, accomplished this incredible feat of supposedly learning to communicate, formally learning to communicate despite her condition, deaf blindness. But I think, most of us do know that story either from reading The Story of My Life in grade school or from the movie The Miracle Worker. But in both cases, it's more about Annie Sullivan, the miraculous teacher, and tends to reduce Helen Keller to a secondary character in her own story.
And in 1916, Keller wrote, "I was taught that God especially loves the poor and the weak," and she became a fierce advocate for racial justice and disability rights. Were you hoping to reframe her story by focusing on these lesser-known aspects of her life in this book?
That's the stuff that's been completely forgotten in history, or most people never heard about in the first place. She grows up in the postbellum South, where white supremacy is firmly entrenched, especially in Alabama, the most racist of all those southern states at the time, which had actually enshrined the words white supremacy in their state's constitution. And she fires a broadside. She sends a letter and a financial contribution to the NAACP in 1916, the fledgling NAACP, where she declares that she's ashamed in her soul to be a Southerner. It sort of struck me that she spends more time, she seems to get more worked up about anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism than she does about discrimination against people with disabilities.
Yeah, that's definitely a side of Helen Keller that a lot of people are not familiar with. Also, the fact that she was a strong supporter of socialist ideology. She even wrote a book called How I Became a Socialist during the height of the Red Scare and McCarthyism. The FBI began tracking her political activities. Now, what does this say about her, that despite all this scrutiny, that she stood by her beliefs?
Well, it's incredible, the sheer magnitude of these decades-long crusades against racism, against fascism during the 30s. She was one of just a handful of Americans that were targeted by the Germans. But Helen Keller spoke 6 languages, including German. So she was following the situation in Germany very carefully. And she spent the rest of the decade as a very outspoken opponent of Nazism, and she also supported the anti-fascist forces during the Spanish Civil War.
And finally, what are some of the lasting impacts that have benefited the disabled community in the U.S. as a result of her lifelong efforts?
She discovered very early on that most of the disability and blindness in America was caused by workplace accidents. So she started to link the roots of disability to capitalism. And she spent the rest of her life talking about systemic poverty. She traveled to dozens and dozens of countries talking about how systemic poverty is linked to disability. So she was this, 100 years ahead of her time, long before disability studies curriculums were talking about these issues and linking disability with gender, race, and class. She very briefly embraced eugenics. And that certainly cast a stain, a permanent stain on her legacy amongst some segments of the disability community.
Wow, Max,
she had her flaws, So one more piece of evidence that she was very much human. She's been cast as a secular saint, but she definitely had her flaws as well.
And you show us that we know little about a story that so many of us heard in our childhood as well. Max, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
After the Miracle, The Political Crusades of Helen Keller is available now wherever books are sold.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.